Hello, everyone, and welcome to our ENSign podcast. In today's episode, we will be previewing the highly anticipated Africa Energy Forum to be held in Kenya. Our main focus will be on the unbundling and deregulation of the electricity generation sector in Africa. I'm Celia Becker, and I'm joined by Eric Legrancy, the head of ENS Africa's Projects Department, Nigel Shaw, who heads up ENS Africa's office in Kenya, and Nkatha Murungi Umondi, an executive in the same office. Historically, electricity generation and distribution in Africa have been dominated by large, vertically integrated utilities. However, the fight against climate change and advances in technology have been changing this landscape. A number of African jurisdictions, including Zambia, Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, and Uganda, have already made some progress towards the unbundling and/or deregulation of the electricity generation sectors. Nigel, if I can start with you, what are generally the benefits of unbundling and/or deregulating the electricity generation sector?
Yeah, thank you very much, Celia. Certainly in Kenya, what has been happening is we're seeing a progression that probably started back in the 1990s when the energy sector started to unbundle a state in which we had the Kenya Power and Lighting Company basically looking after the whole of the energy sector. That was all the way from transmission through to distribution to the ultimate user. And over the years, the KPLC became basically overwhelmed with it. It was just too big a job. And we've seen other parastatals being established, such as KenGen, which is being involved in the generation of the electricity. We've seen Katraco, which sets up with the transmission lines. We've seen other parastatals coming in to take a more specific role in various aspects of the energy sector, which all makes good sense because you've got experts dealing with particular aspects, and those guys over the years will become yet more used to dealing with their particular sector. And so you're ultimately trying to create a place where you've got a better service to the end user. Now, I mean, it's not to say that that's worked in every case. I think generally speaking, it's fair to say that it has been a successful progression of unbundling the energy sector, but there have been failures, for example, in the National Oil of Kenya company that was looking at importing and was responsible for importation of oil into Kenya, but that hasn't worked. We've also seen the oil refinery in Kenya that used to produce oil that has also failed. So it's not correct to say that every aspect of it has worked, but I think in general it has worked. And I think I would go further to also say that what we're seeing now is the distribution of energy actually being looked at from a regulatory point of view for the private sector itself. That allows private companies to come in and get established in Kenya, and they can then go direct to the IPPs and start getting the electricity energy from the IPPs direct, and then on selling it to the retail, rather than having to do it through KPLC, which currently has a monopoly on it. So this is a natural progression, and I can see it happening. Rules and regulations are being put in place for that, and it makes a lot of sense with the opening up of the energy sector in the country generally. So to our mind, unbundling of the energy sector in this country is working, and it seems to be a natural progression.
Yeah, that makes sense, Nee. And Nkatha, I know you've been involved very much in the electricity sector recently. What in your experience have been the challenges and the lessons learned in this unbundling process, and where is the electricity generation sector currently in Kenya?
Thank you, Celia. From a historical perspective, prior to the 1990s, Kenya relied on concessional donor funds to fund the energy infrastructure space. However, in the 1990s, the focus of the donor funding shifted to socio-economical development, starving the infrastructure projects of funds. So this is what facilitated the Kenya government to embark on its journey to unbundle the generation, transmission, and distribution of power as it was then. So it was largely donor-driven policy sector reforms. So the first reforms were with regards to allowing the IPPs to generate electricity and then hiving off the KenGen, the generation assets to KenGen. In terms of challenges, unbundling of Kenya's electricity subsector has been blamed largely for the high prices of electricity that Kenyans pay, particularly with respect to the pass-through costs of standby energy, thermal plants, forex costs, and take-or-pay based PPAs. There are also claims that Kenya's high cost of electricity has been facilitated by procurement methods that don't lead to the true discovery of the electricity generation costs, and also that Kenya Power's monopoly and inefficiencies have led to higher electricity costs. So as Nigel mentioned, a raft of reforms have been proposed to resolve these challenges, starting with the renegotiation of existing power purchase agreements, moving away from take-or-pay mechanisms to take-and-pay mechanisms, moving away from feed-in tariff to a renewable energy auction, mainly for wind and solar projects to facilitate price discovery. And as Nigel mentioned, they regulated the process of enacting regulations to allow for the private sector actors to be licensed in transmission, distribution, and retail of electricity in Kenya. So that would effectively end Kenya Power's monopoly. In terms of lessons learned, Kenya has generally gotten the gist of the importance of designing clear, comprehensive regulatory frameworks. We've been seeing each government comes with its own policy, and so there's not been a consistent policy directive through the various regimes. So that has affected our energy sector.
Thank you, Nkatho. Eric, there's been a lot of talk recently about Eskom's unbundling in South Africa that has been carrying on for a number of years. Could you please explain what are the plans in this regard and to what extent have these been implemented to date?
Thanks, Celia. Eskom's unbundling has been on the cards for a number of years now. And you can imagine that it is not an easy process to go through. If you look at a 100-year-old utility, which was established in 1923, having been under the auspices of government for most of its life, corporatized in 2003 as a vertical utility, government owning all of the shares in the utility, and basically the sole supplier of electricity to the market for the last 100-odd years. The development of, or the lack of investment in new generation capacity over the last 2 decades have basically spelt the end of the vertically integrated utility simply because of the capital requirements needed in order to expand generation capacity in the first instance. The second instance, the move away from fossil fuels. I mean, about 95% of the generation capacity of Eskom is in coal-fired power plants. The drying up of funding for the development of new coal-fired power plants, fossil fuel-based power plants, has basically preempted the move away from the vertically integrated model towards a model where there is not only competition on the generation side, but also competition on the offtake side. So basically what has happened over the last 5 years since the introduction of the concept of the unbundling of Eskom into 3 components, generation, transmission and systems operations, and distribution, is driven by the fact that we need to move closer towards a renewable energy environment with competitive generation costs and where a deregulated market exists, where people can exercise a choice in terms of the offtake. The process has been not swift, but it has been steady over the last 3 years. At this point in time, the creation of 3 entities, generation, transmission and operations, and distribution, is well advanced. We are at the final parts of getting the licensing from the National Energy Regulator of South Africa for the transmission license and operating license to be issued to the National Transmission Company, the NTC. It's probably going to be known as the South African National Transmission Company, which is then a separate operating entity, separately capitalized, and the assets owned by the NTC would be the national grid and the distribution networks, to the extent owned by the NTC. A lot of distribution networks, of course, owned by the municipalities. The anticipated dates for this is towards the back end of this year, for the introduction of the National Transmission Company as an operating entity, to then start controlling not only the grid, but also start controlling and establishing an electricity market. What this electricity market is exactly going to look like is probably still under development. But what we anticipate to see is that there will be a platform where the NTC really is only involved in regulating the availability of the grid, access to the grid, and regulating the relationship between the various suppliers or generators and the off-takers on a day-ahead type of market. So the process towards the deregulation, or firstly, the dismantling of the vertically integrated entity or utility, the introduction of a market where there is the free buying and selling of electricity on a forward-looking market, that is well advanced, and I think that we will probably be seeing that in the not too distant future. Part of this transmission process, of course, is the introduction of corporate and industrial type of arrangements, long-term arrangements between generators and buyers on the one hand, especially in the mining and in the industry and the industrial sector, where you will probably for a period of time still see the wheeling of electricity by utilizing the national grid over longer distances. And that is probably a forerunner to a more deregulated market and a more competitive market, where there is a much more aggressive buying and selling on the day ahead and the immediate future market. What we do see, though, is that you will probably find that market to be not too dissimilar to the regional markets. So the Southern African power pool, there's other power pools in the rest of the continent, which is functioning well. And an interesting point to note on that is that all of the energy being traded on a day-ahead market in the Southern African power pool, for example, is traded. So we are probably getting closer to a market where there is sufficient deregulation for there to be real competitiveness on both the generation and the offtake side, or the consumer side.
Thanks, Eric. As you explained, this is obviously a quite complex process. So Nkatha has alluded to some challenges that Kenya has experienced in this similar process, and also some lessons learned. What do you think are the key factors to be taken into consideration to ensure that Eskom's unbundling would be a success?
I don't think that there's substantive obstacles to the unbundling or the unbundling of Eskom at this point in time. The regulatory process has so far gone quite smoothly. I don't think that there is any political obstacles to the unbundling of Eskom and the changing of Eskom into its 3 components. I also don't think that there is, the unbundling of Eskom is not the privatization of Eskom. It is simply taking the 3 components of the utility and moving it into 3 separate entities, which is then going to be, from a generation perspective, going to compete with the rest of the market as a state-owned entity in the generation of power. The National Transmission Company, as is the case across the world, is an effective utility. It is usually owned not by the private sector, although there is opportunity for private sector involvement in the transmission business. But it is a wires business. It is a business that is fundamentally dependent upon the network being stable, regulating the access to the network from both a generator and an off-taker perspective, and is considered, I think, generally speaking, in the rest of the world as a pure utility, which makes it stable, which makes it non-aligned to any kind of position as far as the market is concerned, and simply just is a facilitator of the buying and selling of electricity. So from that perspective, there isn't really political obstacles to that being implemented. And the same thing with distribution as well. So I don't think that we are seeing enormous problems with implementing the splitting up or the deregulation of the market on the one hand, and the breaking up of the utility itself.
Sure, that sounds very promising. Thank you for that. Nigel, so your home city of Nairobi is hosting the 25th edition of the Africa Energy Forum, as we mentioned. Tell us a bit more about this event and what delegates can expect.
Thank you, Celia. Yeah, I mean, I understand that this is actually only the second time that this particular forum has actually been hosted in Africa. So it's a very exciting time for Kenya. I know that there's some very exciting presentations in the agenda for it. We're expecting thousands of delegates to come to this forum. It's very popular. There will be opportunities for anybody in the energy sector to, of course, meet and network. And to that extent, ENS will be there in force. We have a number of representatives from our various offices around Africa. So there will be a large ENS team there. We will be talking to clients. We will be welcoming all the delegates in the country. And I think it promises to be a very exciting week. It kicks off on Tuesday, the 20th, which is next week, and goes right the way through to the Friday. So there will be huge opportunity for people to interact with one another, to hear the latest on what is happening in the energy sector. And I think there will be also some very interesting presentations made by a number of companies and parastatals, as there always is at this particular forum. So I think it'll be a very exciting week ahead of us.
No, great. It sounds like that indeed. Yeah, just to end off, as part of our biannual regulatory roundup series, ENS Africa will be publishing a paper that discusses the unbundling and deregulation of electricity sector in Africa in more detail, including lessons learned from various other jurisdictions on the continent. So please look out for this exciting publication in the next few weeks. Nkatha, Eric, Nigel, thank you so much for joining me, and we hope to continue this conversation soon.
Thanks, Celia. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much, Celia.